All right, everybody, welcome back to the Pulp Fiction Renaissance podcast. Maybe you woke up one day and you said to yourself, I now live in a military junta. Is it pronounced junta? Junta? I don't know. It's spelled Junta. Whatever. If that is something you've woken up to and you're not too happy about it, Pulp Fiction Renaissance is the place for you with the one and only James Lafond with his iconic eye patch. James, I got to ask, what kind of shirt are you wearing today?
Oh, this is one of my two decent shirts. Deb gave me this one. It's a lady that I'm friends with her husband, and I stay with them here in Utah. So I don't know what this color is, but it's got like the nifty nerdy pocket and everything, right there. It's not stained with like elderberry juice or anything. So, yeah, this is one of my decent shirts.
Very nice, very nice. Well, for what it's worth, I bought this tie at an estate sale for $2. So there we have it. That's the only story I have behind my articles of clothing. Well, James, I'm very excited to talk about this topic with you today. I think it's going to be one you're going to enjoy. Today's topic is, it was on our list, and it is the topic of your recently completed novel, the iconoclast classic Haft, about Saga of the Orcs in Middle-earth.
My editor, I remember I was on a Skype call with her, and it was in New Jersey when I came up with the idea, and I just gave her the 3-sentence synopsis of it, and she smiled. She said, people are going to hate it.
I'm not going to lie.
I got to do it.
I'm not going to lie. I started reading it. I was sitting in my car at break at work. I was eating Arby's, okay? And if you ever sit in your car in a parking lot, and I don't know if it's because it's a flaw with Hondas or what, but you crank the AC up, it never gets cool because you're just sitting in a little oven. So it's hot as heck, and I'm eating this, and I start reading it, and I'm not going to lie, I had to get through that first chapter because I'm reading it, and I'm thinking, wait a second, his mom is a human? His dad is an orc? What are they going to do to this poor hobbit? What is this? And I'm like, oh, man.
It was breakfast. He went to get mom breakfast, so he yanked the hobbit out of its hole. I mean, what else is an orc going to do?
I had to put the double roast beef sandwich from Arby's down for a minute. Because I'm like, I just feel really uneasy. And I'm like, okay, James Lafond, this is what James Lafond does. He writes weird stuff, but he usually brings it around. I got to the end of the chapter, and I'm like, okay, they're not going to eat the hobbit. They're going to keep the hobbit as a pet. Okay. And I'm reading this, and I'm thinking, well, this takes, like, Paul Newman's Hombre. He's a half cowboy, half Indian to a whole nother level. You're like, it was really, really weird. But then once I started reading it, and I got into it, I was like, this is actually really, really good. And I see what he's doing here, and it actually makes sense. So to any of the viewers, just get past that first chapter. That's what I'm going to say. It's going to come around, and you actually, really, I'm going to sound like a liberal here, but you actually start feeling sympathetic for the orcs.
I was surprised that there was some interest in it. I've only lost a third of the readers on that. I usually lose if you look at the history of fiction that I've posted, by the second installment, I've usually lost half of the readers. But a lot of my readers aren't fiction readers. But I think after 9, it looks like I've only lost a third of the readership. I've had a few people contact me and ask me for advance copies. A traditionalist Hebrew friend of mine, Baruch, in Israel. He expressed to my editor that he was concerned that I was patterning the Elves after his people. So I emailed him and I said, Baruch, I said, I understand your concern, but I didn't pattern the Elves after your people. The Elves are hipsters. You know, they're like waspish hipsters. That's who the Elves are. I said, I think you'll be glad to know that I maintain one of the great trade relationships of your people by personifying them as dwarves, and this and this epic. So I said to him, he said he liked it, and, you know. So I sent him a copy of it. I'm glad a couple of people enjoyed it. So you actually enjoyed this day?
I did enjoy it because I was reading it, and when I was reading it, I'll address it. I didn't get the sense that the Elves were patterned after Baruch's people in the slightest. I could totally see they were wasps. I mean, first of all, you know what? I'm gonna circle back around to that. That's gonna be my final point. When I was reading this, and I'm reading about, you know, and you have the poem that that is the Orcs chant, and they talk about what each group of creatures do on Middle Earth. And the Orcs dare. That's the Orcs thing. And I'm reading this and I'm thinking, so the Orcs are like a prototypical postmodern Tacitus Germania. Okay, that's what they are. And when I say postmodern, I don't mean in a liberal philosophical sense. I mean in an artistic sense. The Orcs are these. You think they're kind of simple, but they actually have a really honorable ethics in your book, and they're a warrior people. They live in the forest, and they don't like the machinations, whether they're economic or otherwise, of all these other different groups. And if you go and you read Tacitus Germania, that is what the Germanic tribes, that was their whole shtick as they came into contact with the Romans. They were these warrior people. They're very tough. They're very strong. They live in the woods. They have a co-equal balance between the men and the women, which you illustrated in this book. And you know, they don't like what the Romans do. And I don't know if this was intentional or not, but Haft's grandpa, who is a wizard, I almost got the sense that he was like Tacitus, observing these tribes, and he recognizes there's some honor and there's some nobility in their own strange way. That he was this kind of Roman observer of these Germanics in the same way his grandpa was this wizard observer of these tribes. And so much so that he ends up, you know, in a kind of honor code agreement, gives his daughter to Haft's dad, to which Haft is the product of that union. That's why he's called Haft. He's half human, half orc. He's like Paul Newman in Hombre. He's half cowboy. He's half Indian. Was that all in your mind when you wrote it?
Well, my original concept was to take a human civilization that was essentially like ancient Uruk, a very prototypical civilization with a ziggurat at its center, and then put the halflings, the hobbits, in peripheral contact on the margins, kind of like the Pygmies have this relationship with the Bantus in Africa, where they're often mistreated by the Bantus, but sometimes, you know, they strike the symbiosis. I decided to make the Orcs forest people because I was basing them on the people that I spent most of my life with in Baltimore City. And the favorite men that were the subjects of my early violence survey were African American men that grew up in the Deep South. well, some of them weren't from the deep South, from the Carolinas and Georgia. You don't really get guys from Alabama or Mississippi up in Baltimore, but as deep as it goes is Georgia that were rural guys that came to Baltimore, and you know, they're like Brown City Hicks. They're more like rednecks uh, than what people typically think of when they think of a person of color in an eastern U.S. city. And these guys had a storytelling sense. They liked to rhyme when they talked. They would have like kind of heated inquisitions. You know, I covered some of that in the half for the orc that he duels, because they're not men and women, they're bulls and cows. Okay,
Excuse me. Excuse me.
Bulls and cows, bucks and wontons. Okay, when they're really little, they're just all whelps. But that and actually some of that nomenclature comes from these older guys that, you know, I'm talking about guys that are good 15 years older than me. I wrote a novelized version of Israel Flood's life, and I guess if Flood's still around, he's got to be pushing 90. You know, he came up from rural Georgia on the train and just made a life for himself when he was 13, I think, in Baltimore City. He sold his pig and his chickens and got a train ticket, and basically had to fight his way through neighborhoods in Baltimore and into the working class. So I guess I was kind of, Flood was really my prototype, because he came into a city in the 50s where there weren't a lot of people like him. There were some relatives there. There was an aunt up there, but the most of the people of his race that he would be with, because it was a segregated society, they would be highly urbanized, and he's a country guy, and he's young, so he would have to fight his way up. And the idea for putting the orcs in a forest instead of like in some tundra or barren mountain landscape where Tolkien often put them, because, you know, the elves would be in the forest. I gave the elves a fake forest, a phony forest, that's made out of brass and silver and everything. But for somebody like Flood that didn't spend time in the woods, he spent his time on a farm, and taking his stuff to market, and eventually going to Atlanta and hitchhiking to get a train on these roads. It's pretty open country. It's already been cleared. So for somebody like him, and actually Mr. Kenny was a security guard I worked with. He was older than me when I met Kenny, and I was in my early 30s. And Kenny had 2 full-time security jobs, and he would often have to fight for his life with guys that were a third his age. And he's kind of the star of The Logic of Steel and Win Your Food. And Kenny described the city. He came from Spivey's Corner, South or North Carolina. He was 14 years old when he won the Howard contest. He was a country guy, and he won the Howard contest for his age group. And a couple of years later, he found himself in Baltimore working. He described the city. Baltimore was the biggest city he'd ever been to. Baltimore's like twice the size of Richmond, okay, or a place like Raleigh. He described it as like a forest or a jungle. He used the term jungle a lot. You know, that's not a term that I threw around a lot when I was around him and his people in Baltimore, but he used it a lot. He was kind of lightning rod. So I kind of I patterned the orcs. You know, they're kind of blunt character, and them being bemused and suspicious of the larger order, the civilization they were in contact with. I patterned it after rural African American guys. It would have been they would have been like the youngest baby boomers, or the oldest baby. guys that were born in the 1940s, and then came up to Baltimore in the 50s and 60s. Yeah, so I kind of patterned it on them, and I had to do a lower IQ dialect that had some kind of cadence to it, and I don't know anything about Old English. I wouldn't know how to work with that. I wasn't going to go back and read Canterbury Tales and then do a miserable job of muddling it up. So I just decided to use a dialect that I was very familiar with that has a cadence to it. And for the attitude of the orcs, so I gave them a countrified version of the Baltimore dialect of Ebonics, which is a distantly related to English. So I thought that would work, in honor of Tolkien. He was a philologist. And for actually what I had in the back of my mind, and I used the song once because I'm not a musical person. There's a fellow, the captain that I used to play cards with. We would drink like beer up in the Cascades last year. He would, whenever he would get really upset, he worked in construction, and the safety officers were all male to female transsexuals. Okay, which I don't have a problem with, but that takes competition, away from me. That's okay. When he would get fed up with these guys, girls, whatever, lording it over him, he would play this Willie Nelson song on his phone called "Ain't Going Down on Brokeback Mountain." It's a very simple song. It's and so I actually so I have the orcs. That was where I got the idea for the orc calling the human cigarette Phony Mountain. Okay. So they had this song, don't go mining under Phony Mountain, because I have the humans use the orcs as slaves to work in their mines and row their galleys. And occasionally they'll get a good gig, like stomping humans and dwarves and as a war slave, and they might even get released, and that's fun. But it's not, slaving away for humans isn't always just kicking butt, so it's very often toiling and not so much fun. So again, since it's the rural guys in the United States that generally made up the population of people that go fight its wars, and I kind of made these orcs kind of the mentality of rural guys stuck in a city. That's just kind of how it came together. That Willie Nelson song actually had a lot to do with the formation of the whole orc cosmology. So
that's really funny, because I'll tell you a true story. So I want to make sure I understood this right. All of his safety people are all male to female transgender.
And I actually cover this. I used this fellow as one of the supporting characters in Dollar Joe.
Okay.
And one of them's a carpenter that's at a supervisory level, but he's not the superintendent. No, he's the guy the superintendent leans upon. And I just can't tell you what city this is, because the carpentry is a small place. But when I lived with him, he worked on 2 different large jobs, huge projects that employed hundreds of carpenters. And he was kind of shocked that every new safety officer they got, and the safety officers were in charge of various things like making sure you had your mask on and so on. They were all male to female transgender heroes. Okay. And people he knew, like he knew this guy's name, and he said, "Jimmy, it's really scary." We had the same first name, so he would call me Jimmy, and the family would call me Lafond. Okay, because we both had the same first name as James. And, we abided by it. Apparently, carpentry is the same thing as working in a supermarket. If you're James and I'm James, and you get hired after me, you can't be James. You're like James B or you're Jimmy or you're Jim Stone or Jimbo or Jamie or whatever the people decide you are. So that's the situation. And he said, Jimmy, it's really frightening. I remember working with this guy and he was a pretty good carpenter, and now he's like a cute chick. Yeah, so that it would start to bother him, and then he would turn that Willie Nelson song on. And then he would get over it. So I think he was that character. He had his sense of humor would keep James would buoy him. It would keep him up when he's got a big family and he's got to support the family in a job that's becoming increasingly rough. So I also use that. I kind of use James as part of. I do that with characters. He's kind of based on Flood and Mr. Kenny. Exteriorly, mentally, I made him me as a 13-year-old, and then I evolved him to the guy I'm staying with here, Bob, as an 18-year-old, to Mescaline Franklin as a 27-year-old when I met him. So I kind of did that as far as his mental processes, but like the artifice and the exterior behavior and everything, he's kind of like a cross between my host James and one part of the country who had to work with these transsexual safety officers, and Flood and Kenny. So it's a commish of people.
I was when you said that, I was also amazed by just the high percentage that you said this guy was dealing with. I mean, what are the chances? But it's so funny. We had some friends, and their mom and dad, old school, rural, Gunsmoke watching people. Well, about 2005. New Western comes out. They don't know what it's about. They're going to go see it at the movies, right? Just buy some tickets. Must be a Western. Must be good. And they get in there, and it's Brokeback Mountain. And they're in there for like 20, 30 minutes. Don't even know. And then they're like, whoa! Oh, my gosh!
Yeah, when Heath Ledger spits on his hand, that was about it for me. I mean, actually, a girlfriend insisted on, me watching this with her.
Yeah, I was gonna say, what's the story?
Because she was supposed to watch it for her job. It was part of like a sensitivity training thing, and and she didn't feel comfortable about watching it, so she felt like she would do better watching it if I was holding her hand. And then a certain part, I start with the evil cackle, because I think something's funny that most people don't think's funny. And then she breaks into tears, so it kind of backfired on her. But
oh my gosh, the closest story I have to that was we were when that came out. I think it was 2005, and I remember that because every year we would always watch the Academy Awards because it was awesome stuff that they would award, like Lord of the Rings: Return of the King was up against Master and Commander and Pirates of the Caribbean. Okay, one year I remember that, and I was like, oh my gosh, 3 of my favorite movies. How do I choose? So growing up, I just thought, well, this is Hollywood. This is awesome. And then that year, and it was, I mean, everybody knew, Brokeback Mountain was going to be the whole thing. We did not watch it. I remember because it was like a whole big family thing to watch it, and my mom was like, all right, we're not doing it. I'm not doing it. So I was like 8 or 9, and I turned it on, and it was like, it was Jon Stewart was hosting it, if I remember correctly, and they put all of these weird like clips from classic westerns out of context to make it look really gay, and I'm like, I don't even remember. I'm 9 years old in 2005, so I don't even know. It's not like it is today where all this stuff was out there. I didn't even know what any of this stuff was. I just thought, okay, this is weird. We're not watching it, but I'm watching this, and Yeah, they have this one scene of Charlton Heston, and he's like taking a bath talking to a dude. It's like, it's nothing benign, but they're putting weird music behind it. And he says, Charlton Heston's been lifting the 20 commandments. Looks like it in that scene. Jon Stewart says that, and I say, even 9-year-old Richard, who didn't fully know what was going on, was like, I don't like this. I'm turning this off. And that was the extent of my knowledge of that movie for a long time. But we went to go see one. And we didn't know what it was about. We thought we were going to see American Sniper, but it turns out it was some World War II British movie called The Imitation Game. We're like, okay, well, it's World War II. It's got Churchill in it. The whole gang gets together. And then this guy is going to marry Keira Knightley. And we're like, oh, this is nice. And then we're like, he has no interest in marrying Keira Knightley. And my dad, my brothers, and my grandpa were there. And we're walking out, and my grandpa says, he says, Keira Knightley was okay. I think he could have done it. And I looked at my grandpa, and that was when I knew. I was like, you know what? We are related, aren't we? Because I was thinking the exact same thing.
So, hey.
It
more
was
Keira Knightley for those who want her, right?
I know. You don't. Well, okay. So let's segue into that. That's a perfect segue to that. James Lafond knows, and everybody who knows me knows, I like elf-looking chicks. James Lafond does not. That was pretty clear in his.
I like elf-looking chicks. Okay. I don't like them as much as as the extreme hourglass cartoon hooker.
The orc. Excuse me, not orc women, because that's not what they're called. The orc cows. Definitely, I was reading that. I was like, yes, this is definitely inspired by James Lafond's tastes. I mean, there's nothing James Lafond loves to do more than be creative and be iconoclastic. And I'm reading this, and I'm like, he had an absolute blast writing this. Like, you could just tell he had so much fun going to town.
It was kind of tough. I try to do sex like tastefully. Lily Lamore's always rattling around in my mind. Nothing graphic. That you shouldn't write that. So I try not to. But I think I did an okay job doing orc sex as tastefully as orc sex could be done.
You did. It wasn't like you kind of abided by the 1965 rule where you kind of cut the camera when things started happening, and then you kind of picked it back up after it was over. So I thought it wasn't too painful to read. It wasn't.
Yeah. Some of it was from personal experience, like the part where the queen of the orcs, knocks him out and then basically molests him. I had that happen to me. It was only a 105-pound girl that did it. Of course, it was after I fought 4 hours in the tournament. And there's also a part where she grabs him by the ankle and like drags him out to the other orcresses. And I injured myself one time when I was with a lady, and she actually carried me to the car and then carried me into the chiropractor's office. She was not the 105-pound girl. This was a strapping woman.
James Lafond says, this is the benefit, of dating these large-ass females. As James
I've been the subject of female aggression before, so I figured the orcs were going to be pretty savage. The orc females are going to be pretty savage, So I just delved into, my memories of mating dysfunction fast. So
my family knows somebody. You'll think this is hysterical, okay? And like, I grew up with her, and she was a crazy person, okay? And she had Asperger's, but she was wildly intelligent, and she knew how to like manipulate people's emotions. Like, oh, she has Asperger's, okay, cut her some slack. But she was she always knew what was going on, and she was in our group, was kind of like, you know how in the medieval times the court jester could say whatever he wanted, that nobody else could say. Like, he gets a pass if he wants to make fun of the king or the queen or whatever. That's his job. It's like, okay. And that was her shtick that she had kind of manipulated. So she could say whatever she wanted about anybody in the group, and it'd be like, oh, she has Asperger's. Okay, everybody, don't. But she she was very, very cunning, and she was on all this medication that caused her to gain all this weight. Well, so then she got off of it, and then she became a world traveler and went to China and Puerto Rico and all these places and became a fire jumper, okay? And there's also videos of her all over her social media of her doing some pole dancing as well. Now, I don't think this was in a professional context, but this is a woman that is just nuts. And I was not a big fan of her, okay? But my mom really liked her because she was just absolutely the most independent person you would ever meet, who was going to do whatever she wanted to do, okay? And she always was. And so she said, well, she drifts all over the place. She can stay at our house. And I said, what the? I said, so she can stay at our house, but James Lafond can't stay at our house. And she says, well, I said, if she can stay at our house, James Lafond can stay at our house. She's like, I don't know. She's like, well, maybe they could get together. She's a little on the curvier side. James Lafond likes that. She's like, from what you tell me, he seems to be a glutton for punishment. Because, oh yeah, she can't feel pain either. Because of her Asperger's, I literally watched her accidentally stick a 6-inch knitting needle up her calf by accident. She like tripped over it and it impaled her calf. She didn't even feel it. She didn't even feel it. She has no sense of pain at all. Okay. So she's a character. So my mom's like, dude, you could get her together with James Lafond. That would be good. I'm like, he probably would like that.
Like, she would be an interesting interview for sure.
She would. Oh my gosh, dude, she would be an interesting interview. She was quite a character. She is quite a character. But so this brings it around, James. So when I was reading Haft, I recently last week was reading a guy named he's a Brazilian political commentator. His name was Olavo de Carvalho. Okay, now I may be mispronouncing that. So to all the Brazilian viewers, I apologize. But I mispronounce things in my own language all the time if you've been watching this for a little while. So, but Olavo de Carvalho, he laid out 3 different groups of bad guys in the world. And his first group was the evil Western elite. His second group was the Russians and Chinese, and his third group was the evil jihadists. And it was really interesting because everybody has their own favorite bad guy, okay? Whatever their life experiences may be. Obviously, as you know, the jihadists are my favorite bad guy that I always talk about. From my parents' generation, the Cold War generation, they love the Russians and the Chinese. But James Lafond, his favorite bad guy, he's the Western elite. Because they are the ones who have caused him the most misery in his personal life. And as I was reading Haft, I knew immediately that the elves were the WASP elite. First of all, if you go back and you read the original Lord of the Rings, this idea of they're this tall, blonde, skinny, noble race. They're like the purebred Madison Grant Nordic that has been untouched in the woods. And there's a lot of those kind of people up in the Northeast corridor, and you meet them. And speaking from personal experience, their women are very, very, very attractive. But the unfortunate reality that divests from the Madison Grant fantasy, I think you mockingly referred to it as brood home of the Europeans. You thought that was pretty funny in one of his articles. A lot of these people are, unfortunately, outside of appearance, have nothing to do with the ancient Nordic Germanic conquerors. And they are very, very, very bad people. They are bad people who only care about, being at the top of the social and economic pyramid, and they don't mind crushing anybody that they have to get there. There's very little honor. So I was reading that and I was saying, James Lafond is taking the Tolkienian fantasy, because you got to remember when Tolkien was writing, all of the Indo-European studies that we've talked about on here were pretty mainstream. They were pretty mainstream. They weren't kind of the bastard stepchild kept in the corner of the closet today. But he updates it from this old time fantasy, which still kind of motivated people back in his day. And he updated it into the nasty, nasty modern world we live in. I mean, that was what I was thinking as I read it. Did I capture your thinking correctly? Was that in your mind when you wrote it?
Oh, that I really had two prime sets of villains in half. One was the Elves. They're on the face of it. That's the most evil threat to the Orcs, which is, I kind of based that on urban politics. The people that run the companies that are going to screw over the urban people that are living in their, concrete, asphalt, and brick forest. That they know who it is that doesn't have their best interests at heart, and they kind of prey upon them in a vampiric way. But that's the horrific threat that the Orcs face. But the larger existential threat that the Orcs face is the human civilization, because it's eventually going to destroy their forests. It's actually going to eliminate their habitat. So, but there are things about, this is where I kind of used the colonial plantation America setting as an inspiration, because people don't realize that the animal life that was wiped out in mass tonnage in most of North America was wiped out by Native Americans who were trading these animal hides to Europeans to get equipment that would help them fight other Native Americans. So by the time the by the time of the French and Indian War in upstate New York and New England, Rogers Rangers are starving to death because there's no animals to hunt in the forest, and very little of the forest has been cut down. So those are the humans represent civilization, really, and the threat of civilization. And the wizards amongst them, the most intelligent and most manipulative, are the ones that pose the biggest threat to all the life of Middle Earth, and that's reflected by Haft falling in with his one ally later in the book, where this other being has been done wrongly by, I think, Wizard One is what Haft calls him. The one in his proud tower. But the elves represent the parasitic, societal parasitism, which that is where we are here. So I felt like that kind of represented the elves represented something that people could get into more now, where you really don't even get to see the people that are making the decisions. You really don't even know who's made these different decisions that some politician is just placing before you as a mandate or whatever. So for me personally, the biggest villain is the person that gets their way through the use of falsehood and lies. And I think that's where the European elite had to go, and all elites in the European experience end up going to this lie situation, because you don't have on other continents and in the ancient Near East, everybody knew that the only person who was not a slave in the Archimedean Empire was the King of Kings, whether he was Darius or Xerxes or Artaxerxes or Cyrus. That was it. Everybody else was a slave. This is known. This is Asiatic. This is the way Asiatics look at it. Okay, your Amerindian civilizations, the Aztecs, the Mayas, and Incas. This is how they looked at it. In the Indo-European setting, you have a rejection of slavery as a common lot, in particular as the lot of the warrior. It's what gives the edge in infantry combat so often to the European, because there's a low-level heroic tradition. And this is really shown very well in Herodotus. Now, in Europe, once the conquest is done, and then the grandchildren and the descendants way down the line of the conquerors, now they want to maintain their position, and they're going to end up rolling over an order that's just as slavish. You know, the one falsehood all through Tolkien is that there's no slavery in the European medieval setting, is what he used. And that's what he used. Now that's very false. The medieval European setting was almost as slavish as any other civilization on the planet. There is still these vestigial notions of independence among the yeomen, but the yeomen's a very small minority. The peasants, we think of the peasants as everybody. No, most of the people were serfs. They were technically owned by the land. So I wanted to put the servitude aspect in Middle Earth out there. Middle Earth isn't like a trademark Tolkien idea. It's just an old Nordic Germanic idea that we live between heaven and hell. So the manipulative aspect of the ruling class doing so much to misrepresent their goals and their actions. Everything you're forced to do is for your own good. It's for your safety. It's for your prosperity. Blah blah blah. When if it comes down to meat packing, you know, there's only a couple of places where you're allowed to pack meat in any given state. And we're told it's for our safety, but it's really so these super rich people can monopolize meat packing and put the small guy out of business. So I thought, if I'm using the orcs as they're a low IQ people, right? I mean, that's what orcs are, stupid. And even Haft is only intelligent enough to figure out a certain amount of things because he's half human. And this is why the real reason why the wizard arranges a marriage between a female, which he claims is his daughter, and it's up to the reader to decide whether or not it's really his daughter, is to try to produce a messiah for the orcs by having one of them be half human. And so he's really like a eugenicist. That's a wizard. He's like the second tier wizard. He's like Saruman, and he's been put on. He's chafing under the rule of Sauron. So he's manipulating the orcs, which is actually what Saruman did. If you look at the Two Towers, Saruman is essentially like this eugenicist that's using these orcs almost as an industrially produced creature.
Yes.
And then the attitude of the orcs that they're always enslaved by the humans, that really comes from the Return of the King. There was a delightful animated Rankin and Bass version of the Return of the King, where they're singing songs and stuff and they're being whipped to battle, that I used to watch with my oldest son. So I thought that if you're an orc, if you're a creature that's basically at best semi-retarded and you've got to try to resist human expansion, the thing that's really going to get you is the manipulative aspect of human civilization. And nobody gets more manipulative than the European, and particularly Anglo-European elite around the world, because they're operating in a pure power-hungry sense like any other ruling elite in the world, but they're doing it under the fiction that it's for the common people, that nations were developed at the Peace of Westphalia, basically as an instrument of tyranny that could be controlled and keep from destroying the economic base by having to deal with mercenary armies that then, once you're done paying them, they go and they wreak mischief. But we're told that a nation is always for the good of the people, when a nation is just trying to take an ancient evolved kingdom that way back evolves from a chiefdom, and trying to make that more economically functional in the gunpowder era. Okay, that's what a modern nation is. It's a very artificial construct that was developed with pure power, the use of power in mind, and it's currently being discarded by a larger scale order that now sees this artificial structure as an impediment to even better economy of scale. So in a way, I kind of made the orcs all of us that are in a trade that's kind of been offshored, sent to another country. That's anybody that listens to country music or heavy metal or rap. Those three groups of people, I tried to keep them in mind. The people that are being rendered obsolete by the manipulative ruling class, whoever they are, and they're, in my mind, they're more economic and information infotech people than politicians. The politicians I see kind of as puppets of the people that really run things.
That's really interesting. I got a few things to say that just really you brought home. If you read, I know you've talked about it on your website, and I'm not even going to try to pronounce the author's name. The Book of Five Rings by the Japanese samurai.
Miyamoto Musashi. I read that, I read it actually 8 times. Guy gave me a hard time for only reading it 7 times. So I went back and read it again, and I still think he was wrong in his assessment of the School of the Two Swords. But anyhow, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, Musashi, there's a quote in there. And he says, he's talking about the 4 social classes that we're always talking about. And he says, we of the warrior class don't really like the merchant class, but we have to tolerate the merchant class because they make money that fund all of our great adventures and build our swords and weapons. And he's like, so we got to deal with them. And I thought that was a really interesting assessment, that in a lot of, I don't do Asian history. That's not my area of expertise. I'll leave that to other people. But my area of interest that I've studied for a long time is the British Empire. And they had for a big period in the British Empire, they had a symbiosis where they said, okay, the economic, the East India Trading Company, for example, this is a money-making enterprise. But you can take a guy like Robert Clive, who was an English street fighter, who his mom sent him to go be a clerk at the East India Company for his uncle to keep him off the street because he was really good at street fighting and kept getting in trouble. And a guy like him, they could send him over and say, okay, you have your fun slaying all the slave armies of the Mughal Empire. Do what you want to do. And there's like a symbiosis. And for 200 years, it was symbiosis. Now, fast forward to World War I, and you read T.E. Lawrence, 7 Pillars of Wisdom. And in the first chapter, and I know we've talked about doing a full podcast on this, there's a lot you get into, so I'll only keep this very short, but there's this sense he understands that after the war is over, this kind of uneasy symbiosis between the merchant class and the warrior class that allowed these warriors to do their thing and go on their adventures and basically run things like they wanted to because it was 10,000 miles away on another continent, it was over. And now the merchant class runs everything. The government ministers in London are now going to come, who've never had any experience with anything in the Middle East, with any of the people that he lived among and had a close relationship with. Well, now he's not going to get to make any decisions about that. The government ministers are going to make all of these decisions about how to order things in order to best line their pocket. And if there's some collateral damage, well, it's just the price of doing business. And you see his disgust with that. And that he was, before his time, I mean, he was like the last kind of generation really used where there was an understanding. Yeah, we have a symbiosis. It's okay. Nobody really believed that after his generation, at least in the British experience. And after that, there was no really any British Empire left anymore. You talk about the vampire element in Haft was great because number one, vampires are bad. Nobody likes vampires. They're evil. So that was a really good way to kind of circumvent any contemporary readers. Anybody that's read Tolkien knows the elves are like the pinnacle of goodness, right? And so I'm reading this and I'm like, this is kind of hard to, this is kind of accept because it's playing with what you, thought you knew about Tolkien. When you make them vampires, you say, oh, okay. That kind of makes it easier to accept they're bad. And it works stylistically because elves and vampires look a lot alike. They're tall, skinny, extremely white. Their skin kind of glows. They are usually a noble group of people, but one is traditionally depicted as good and one is a literal blood-sucking parasite. Was that in your mind when you wrote that? I have to ask.
Well, we're going to end up doing, I won't get too far into it because we're going to end up doing one on vampires.
Yes.
But, you said nobody likes vampires. Well, in America, everybody's loved vampires for the last 40 years. You have, and we can get into that fiction, but the reason why the unhealthy complexion of the elves, okay, was one aspect that made me think vampires. But when I'm thinking of, the decadent hipster, manipulator, the person that looks down upon anybody that works with their hands or anybody that fights, those are the same people that flock to see all these vampire movies, okay, like Breaking Day and all these heroic, kind of like soap opera-based vampire movies. So that's really where I got the idea of it. And I wanted to use the elves as like an ancient kind of always there taking a couple of you vampires as the ancient vampire. And the human civilization is like the world vampire, that it's actually eating the habitat and it's going to drain all of the life out of the world. So, and I placed the humans against dragons, okay, in this novel. And I got that from what I think was one of Tolkien's great inspirations, okay. The Edison, I forget his first name, I think it was two letters, okay. His last name was Edison. He wrote The Worm Ouroboros, okay. This is the worm that circles the world and has its tail and its mouth. The same symbol that John Milius used for his version of Robert E. Howard's Conan setting, Hyperborea, where the bad guy had the snake eating its tail. Okay, this ancient symbol of, it goes back to Gilgamesh and the serpent in the Garden of Eden, the knowledge-keeping serpent, the dragon. The Worm Ouroboros is a novel of induction that was written a dozen years before Tolkien started on his work and is thought to have influenced C.S. Lewis and Tolkien. So that they deserve their own podcast. But I'd like to mention these two very minor guys that most people don't know about because they were inspirations for these more widely read fellows. And the first is Edison. Now, Edison in The Worm Ouroboros takes a human point of view out of post-World War I, right after World War I, and takes them into a fantasy world where it's all populated by demons. Everybody from a human perspective, they're all demons. Even the heroes have like tails and stuff like that. And these guys are actually like these heroic demon creatures. And the novel is ultimately about not hating the enemy and not dehumanizing them, not, calling him a Hun or something like that, and saying, well, they're on the wrong side of things, so they're not human. And in the end of this novel, I summarized it, I think, in like 40 episodes. I think every chapter I did a summation somewhere 4 years ago. I don't know what book it's in. But for a while, I was combining books with literary criticism and travel writing. So who knows where it is? But at the end, the great tragedy that's faced by these demons, the good demons that actually defeated the bad demons, was that they didn't have any enemies left. There was nothing else for them to test themselves against. They weren't going to be able to demonstrate their good contrasted against evil, and everything was going to start to get muddy. So one of the noble characters, there was a group of brothers, and half the novel spent looking for a lost brother that's been taken away. One of them at the end is kind of stricken with a sense of joy because he realizes that they didn't kill the world's circling worm. The evil was going to rise again, and there was going to be a chance to be heroes again. Okay, so it was kind of like an idea of Aragorn's nothing if you don't have the Dark Lord. Okay, so you need a bad guy for the good guy to be good, and if there's no bad guy, then the good guys are going to gravitate towards this gray middle ground, and heroism's going to end up dying. That's where we are. And the guy that probably did expanded on that, another World War I veteran who lost his mind while he was writing the third book in his trilogy. His name was Mervyn Peake, and he wrote Titus Groan, Gormenghast, and Titus Alone. That was his trilogy. And imagine if Dickens had somehow lived through World War I and then wrote about a magical realm that was pretty much all inside of these great Gothic structures. Okay, and Titus Groan is the heir to a throne that's under threat from all these manipulative characters. So when you see these great writers that survived as combatants in World War I, Edison, Mervyn Peake, C.S. Lewis, and J.R.R. Tolkien, you see that the main thing that they're concerned with, if you read the Screw Tape Letters, the Abolition of Man by C.S. Lewis, and then you read Tolkien and these other guys that I just mentioned for you. If you read this, you see their great concern is the lie. That's what these guys were really concerned about, was the lie. There was going to end up being this great gray area, and the lie was just going to thrive. And Tolkien wrote about it in such a way that it's going to appeal to children, okay, and appeal down through the generations. So it's the one we like the most. C.S. Lewis had his way of connecting with children with the Chronicles of Narnia, and then he also wrote separately for adults in the Abolition of Man and the Screw Tape Letters. So, and he wrote a pretty hard to read trilogy. One of the titles is Our Hideous Strength, I think. So the fact that all these guys came out of World War I and they were so concerned about the lie, and that there was somebody up in a dark tower conspiring, I theorize that they either consciously or subconsciously had that none of the people that started that war participated in that war. And that war was the first European war that killed over 10 million people. Okay. So you have people that are more like who they're fighting, okay, dying in great numbers in service to an extended family that's ruling all these European countries that got in a family squabble that, there's, I have a friend who got his PhD on German diplomacy between 1898 and 1914. It's such a muddy area. Of World War One is the toughest debate that any historians could engage in. But when you look at it on a really big picture and from the combatant's perspective, which I know that's not supposed to go together, but if you try to look at it from a big picture, from the point of view of a guy that's emerged from the trenches, you get the idea of what Barbara Tuchman wrote about in The Proud Tower, her prequel to The Guns of August, that there's decisions being made by people who don't have real skin in the game. And those decisions are putting millions of men who are very much like each other in mortal combat with each other. And I think that's what all of these great fantasy novelists wrote about between 1920 and 1950. They survived World War One, and I think this is the aggregate lesson that you get from reading these 24 works that these fellows write, is they're mainly concerned about the lie as a manipulation from above in a field of gray, which fits the industrial tone. There's a lot of industrial overtones to Tolkien, for instance, particularly how he deals with the two different Dark Lords. And that's the way Mervyn Peake did it was the starkest, because he reaches right back to Dickens and kind of like a working class appeal, because for the working guy, the guy that's just got a crappy little job that could be erased at any time, that guy, and to me, that's the orc, okay? Because the thing that's most threatening to that guy, the small field working guy, is the decision that's going to be made that he doesn't even understand the basis for the decision. It's made in some high distant place. And I think we all face that. So that's what I was trying to address in a fantasy aspect, what I addressed in Dower Joe, in like an urban rampage novel setting. And I wrote them kind of like back to back.
If I don't stop this now, this is going to be a 5.5-hour podcast.
Okay.
Because
I think we got seeds for a few other podcasts.
I'm going to say this. This is great, because I want to pick this topic back up. Because as you know, I wrote and published my first book on World War One, The Forgotten History of World War One from the Dark Ages to 1939. And there is a lot of richness there that I grew up in the homeschool community, and the homeschool community venerates, Tolkien and C.S. Lewis. However, they do not examine the world that made them. And most are going to say Tolkien was a World War I veteran. And then they're going to show a picture of, it's that famous painting of those British soldiers that are they're wounded and they've been gassed. And then they're going to say, well, when Frodo and Sam are wading through the marsh, that was his inspiration for World War I, and that's it. Okay. Whereas in my book, I read, every manual on the British training you could read, and was just really just so passionate about what their entire culture was that went to war. A lot of people don't understand it when they talk about it. But there's a great quote, and I'll end it with this, that sums up what you're saying. There's a story. A book was written by a fellow named Charles Edmund Carrington. It was called Soldiers from the Wars Returning. And he was like the British version of Ernst Younger, but not metaphysical, because let's be honest, British don't do that kind of stuff. And that's also repeated. That's a repeated theme in a lot of these war memoirs. They say these Germans get really metaphysical about things. Us British, we keep it simple, and the French get really romantic about stuff. And that's a common theme in a lot of those writings. But he said before the war, he'd read a story, and it was, I'd have to go back and read it, and I've got it on the shelf. I can't remember if it was called The Green Line or The Purple Line or what. But he said it was from 3 different perspectives. One was they're fighting in the trenches. This is written before the war, if I remember it correctly. I'm going to go back and look at this, and on the next podcast when we talk about this, I'm going to see if I got it right. One is these guys in the trenches, and they're fighting and they're dying. The other one is the operational level battalion commander, who's like a major, lieutenant colonel or something, and he's making these decisions, but he's close enough to see the results of them. And then the other guy is a staff officer at the headquarters, and he's got these charts, and he says, you know, if we just follow the correctly colored line on this chart all the way to the end, that's what we're going to base all of our decisions off of, and we're going to win. Well, he's doing it, and he's doing it, and he's doing it, and he gets to the end, and he realizes he's been doing the green line the whole time, and he was supposed to be doing the purple line, and that's why everybody's dead. Because and he said, I would often think about that story, because this guy went on, and he was a lieutenant in World War I, and volunteered for a lot of the trench raiding parties. He really likes to do that, and then he became a battalion commander in World War II. So he has a really, that's a very unique perspective of a book. But it shaped a lot of these authors. And the final thing I'll say on this, and we can get into this much more depth later, but all these guys who wrote, whether they were the big names that you know, Tolkien, C.S. Lewis, or these guys you've never even heard of, the entire British World War I generation, those guys were very intelligent, and they were very well educated. They knew they could all speak Greek, they could all speak Latin, like they'd learned this at 12, and they knew all of their mythology, they knew all their symbology. People think Carl Jung and Joseph Campbell invented, or even some people today think Julius Evola invented all this stuff. That entire class of people knew it all. They knew it all. So there was a lot of mythological depth going into these stories that contemporary people miss because they've never even heard about it. So that's all I have to say on this topic before we go on for a marathon podcast. So James, thank you so much for doing this. Everybody, go out, get Haft. It's on Substack right now, right? It's being serialized on Substack by Lynn Lockhart.
The first, basically how my novels get treated now. I usually write 16 chapters, okay? The first 9 will go up on my main site, and then the 7 concluding chapters will go up on Substack. And I did just send her one, Beyond the Pale, which is a fantasy, where will all be on Substack. You know, the first 6 will be in front of the paywall. The final 9 will be behind the paywall. Dower Joe is, which is actually half the inspiration for Haft, was this Dower Joe story that I wrote. I put first half of that on jameslafond.com and put up the second half on Substack. So if you just join the Substack thing, you could read the conclusions to my monthly novel on there. It takes a while to get them in print. She likes to, Dower Joe's in print now, but you know, it takes a while to get these things in print. So they're available electronically long before they are in print, because she's got a 63 book backlog right now. So as far as getting things in print, because I just sent her 3 more books, and I'm going to send her another one next week. So Substack's where you can find the conclusions to these things.
So go to jameslafond.com, then join Substack, read the whole thing. When it comes out in print, get the print book, put it on your bookshelf next to your Lord of the Rings box set trilogy. And, you know, make it past that first chapter. And once you do, and really start thinking about it, think critically, and you will enjoy Haft. One of the most bizarre, it could be the most bizarre thing James Lafond's ever wrote. He's written some bizarre stuff. So enjoy, and we will see you next time at the Pulp Fiction Renaissance podcast.
Thank you.